My great pleasure to introduce our first speaker of today, Dr. Mike Shadlen. Dr. Mike Shadlen is a professor of neuroscience and principal investigator at Columbia Zuckerman Institute. He studies the neurobiology of decision-making and has made fundamental contributions to this field by combining behavior, electrophysiology, and computational methods. In his lab, Dr. Shadlen studies how we turn visual signals into behavior. He focuses on the brain's parietal cortex, a region that acts as a go-between, linking areas that take in sensory input to those that prepare the body to act. Dr. Shadlen started his career as a physician, but was drawn to the lab because there were so many gaps in what we knew about the brain. He hopes that his work to decipher the fundamental components of cognition will one day help treat people with disorders, ranging from schizophrenia to autism to dementia. And as a postdoc in his lab, I have had the pleasure to work together with Dr. Shadlen, and I can attest to him being an incredibly supportive mentor and dedicated teacher, in addition to being such a successful researcher. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Shadlen to the virtual stage for his talk, Decision-Making as a Model of Thought.
Great. Well, thank you very much for the introduction, and those last words you mean a great deal to me. So thank you for touching my heart. Okay, so let's see. How shall I begin? Well, 9 years ago, at a ceremony celebrating Mort Zuckerman's gift to endow the Mind, Brain, and Behavior Institute, Mort asked this question. Whoops. What is the form and content of a thought in the brain? I've been thinking about that for about 50 years, and this is the first time I'm going to try and answer that in public. And so let's have a little bit of fun tonight, and I'll try and keep this as informal as possible, just burdening you ever so slightly with some neuroscience. So here's the thing. I'm going to answer this question, I hope, in the next 14 minutes, and it's going to be based on the neuroscience of decision-making. And then I'll add in there what's the difference between a thought that we experience consciously and one that occurs without conscious awareness. And as a dividend, try to reconcile what turns out to be a very rational brain, as I'll convince you in a moment, with the irrational propensities of its owner. And I'll do that without any reference to politics, except for right now. Okay, so in the lab, we study decision-making because we view it as a window on higher brain function in general. And as Anne mentioned, we think that really, well, what I think is that decision-making carves cognition at its joints. And those joints are the joints that fail in dementia and other disorders that affect the mind. And I'll give you a little bit of a feel for that as we go along. Okay, and I'm at the Zuckerman Institute. We use mouse, monkey, humans, and one day maybe collaborate with our fly colleagues to try and understand this at a variety of levels, because ultimately we would like to understand what the human brain does in a language, in a biological language that will be addressable in disease. That's a hope. So now, our first insight really comes from a neurological perspective, that thoughts are structured as interrogation, using a term that kind of resonates with decision-making. The brain basically poses questions and answers them with evidence from the senses and from memory. And those questions are posed as possible behaviors. I know this seems to run counter to the current trend to think about the brain as like a computer doing information processing. That's just not how the brain works, though. It asks questions of the world, gets answers, and that's how it knows. So an insight from neurology that I'd like to share comes from patients that have what's called parietal neglect. So this is the blue here, is you're looking at a brain on the right side. So this is the right hemisphere of a brain, and this blue is the parietal lobe. And it and the temporal lobe, which I'm outlining with my mouse, assuming you can see that, are the areas of the brain that when you lose them, you have something called agnosia, which is the loss of knowledge. In the Greek, gnosis means knowledge. And so what happens to parietal patients is that they not only don't know about the left side of the world, like asked to draw this clock, copy it, and draw from memory, or copy these other images. They kind of tend to neglect things on the left side of the world, or even the left side of other things in the world. It's not just half of the visual field. And the thing is that they don't know this. And they're exactly unlike a patient that has lost vision maybe because of a stroke in the right visual cortex who comes to the doctor complaining that they can't see very well. But the parietal patient, what they really lack is the part of the brain that asks questions about the world. Is that some place I might want to look at? Is that some place I might touch on my body? And so forth. And they lack awareness of the objects of those questions. But that's because they lack the ability to ask the question in the first place. So let's take a closer look at the parietal lobe by looking at another image of a drawing of a monkey brain. This is the same, a smaller brain, but this has the same parietal regions. And we see that it's parcellated into little subgroups of areas. And each area has a partner in the front of the brain that actually kind of controls the behavior. When you lose the front part of the brain, you get things like paralysis and apraxia, the inability to organize movements. But back here in the parietal lobe, what you lose is knowledge. You don't have knowledge about the world. Okay, and one of these areas cares about where we look, like it talks to the front part of the brain that moves the eyes around. Another part, how we reach. Another part, say how we might hold our hand to grab an object if we felt like doing it. And so, and I would argue that these actually contain or hold on to knowledge of the world in the form of an answer to the question, might I? And then fill in the blank. Might I reach? Might I walk between these two things? If we're talking about the temporal lobe, we might say, might I eat this? Might I come back to this path that I rejected the first time I saw that T-junction? And so on and so forth. These are all things that the body or of animals and us do in the world, but we're basically asking questions, looking for evidence that bears on whether we'll do that. Now, I realize I skipped the definition of a decision, but I might as well say it here. A decision is a commitment to a proposition based on evidence gathered mostly from the world through the senses, but also from memory stores inside the brain, and then and uses them and reaches through deliberation at least a provisional commitment to do something or to say something or just to believe in the proposition. So you can see how interrogation sort of fits right into that definition. Now let's look even closer and go inside the parietal lobe and to that part that communicates with the eye movement areas, and try to sample the electrical activity from just a single neuron in this area. This is an MRI of a monkey brain, and I'm just painting the part of the brains that we're interested in. Now, neurons don't make sounds, but they do make electrical activity, as I hope many of you know. And the nice thing about the electrical activity is that we can spy on the neuron with a little piece of metal, tiny, microscopic, and sample that electrical discharge from the one neuron and listen to it by just amplifying the electrical discharge into the loudspeaker. So let's see if you can hear spikes from a neuron while a monkey does a very simple memory task. He's asked to remember the location of that briefly flashed spot, and then ultimately he's going to make an eye movement there. So let's listen to the neuron as he does this very simple task. Can someone give me a thumbs up if you heard the spiking? Okay, I'm going to assume you all heard it. Yes?
We had.
Great, great. Okay, so this activity, what you heard are these little tick marks. Those are the spikes from the neuron. That's how a neuron communicates to other neurons. And what you can sort of see here and what you heard was an elevation in the discharge of the neuron after the light came on and off. And I would submit to you that is a thought. And the content of that thought in this case is something very simple, a non-conscious thought. A thought about the where of a really as yet to be analyzed object. But there's a certain thing about it, a certain awareness. I mean aware with the W, not awareness. We'll get to awareness, like conscious awareness, in a few minutes. But you're looking at what a thought is in the brain. And the interesting thing about thought is that it is flexible in time. It's what gives us our freedom from the immediate demands of processing a sensory world. So we don't have to obey it immediately, like bundles or bags of reflexes. We can deal with it on our own terms, in our own time. And similarly, we can control our bodies, which is a real-time engineering problem, but we can delay when we do that and control the pace at which we do things, all thanks to this kind of persistence in the brain. So if you ask me, the evolution of higher brain function and thought came with the emergence of that freedom from immediacy and persistence. Now, the neural activity that we're recording from these neurons in this part of the brain is spatially selective. And to illustrate that, if we flash the red spot over here, we no longer see that elevated discharge, okay? And I'm going to suggest that this discharge is the outcome of something like a decision. And in fact, we can study decision making by exploiting the property of these neurons that they can tell us whether a monkey is going to think, for example, that this might be a better eye movement than this target being, say, more predictive of reward than this one. And we can do experiments where we give the monkey a reason to choose this over that, because he would choose this if he thought the net direction of these little flittering about dots tends to be blowing to the right as opposed to the left. It is blowing to the right. Okay? So it turns out that what I'm now going to try to convince you of, using a very different experiment, but an easy one to grasp, is that this persistent activity, which just looks like someone turned a switch on, is actually the substrate not just of on and off thinking or commitment, but actually the substrate of reasoning. So what we do is, in this experiment, is the two people I flashed up so quickly you barely saw them. Here you go. What we do? Whoa, are you kidding me? Please tell me that isn't a text saying I'm done. No. Okay, I guess I'm getting close though. I can't see your text, by the way, Paula. I'm sorry. Anyway, so very quickly, I'm nervous that I'm running over time. Okay, the monkey is going to...
5 minutes.
What? How much?
5 minutes.
Oh, great. Okay. So the monkey is deciding whether reward is associated with this green target or this red target, and he's deciding it based on these shapes. So 5 shapes support probabilistically. They're not sure bets. They don't guarantee a reward at green, but they make a reward at green more probable. Similarly, these 5 shapes make a reward at red more probable. And you'll notice that some shapes are more reliable than others. Okay? So the idea is the monkeys, it turns out, can combine this probabilistic information to make the best possible decision. And so, for example, if they see weak evidence for red, followed by a triangle and Pac-Man and another Pac-Man, that might be weak evidence for red followed by mounting evidence for green. And it would, if the numbers were right, green might be more likely to give a reward than red. So let's listen to the discharge from a neuron, just like the ones I just showed you. And this happens to be a neuron that's interested in the area of space that's currently occupied by the red target. Okay, so on this trial, there was a shape that initially favored the red target. And look, that neuron cares about that red target, you might say, and there's an increase in the discharge. I hope you heard that. But then that was followed by a succession of shapes, triangle and 2 Pac-Men, that led to a evidence against the red and for the green target, and that was associated with this decrease in the activity, this decrescendo in the firing. Okay, let's look at another trial. Okay, so in this case, the first shape favored the green target outside this neuron's response field. Remember, the neuron cares about this red target, which is the one he ultimately chose. But then the next shapes gave mounting evidence for the red target. And you see that that's associated with this increase in the firing rate. You can tell the firing rate's increasing just visually, even if you didn't hear it very well, because you see the gaps between the spikes get narrower and narrower. It just like fills the field here. Let's one more trial. All right, so this one was even more interesting to me anyway. It starts out with evidence for the green target, which is this is the part of the visual field that this neuron cares about. So maybe there was a little bit of activity here, kind of hard to say. But then that's followed by this decrescendo again, as there's mounting evidence for red. And then finally, a very strong evidence for green, which is ultimately the choice the animal made. And so now what we get the sense of is that these neurons are kind of doing a running addition and subtraction. They're increasing the response, they're decreasing the response, and they're doing a cumulative sum. And it turns out that what they're doing is computing something about the relative value of the two options. And what they're really doing is computing with numbers that turn out to bear a resemblance to what a statistician or an actuary would do, or an economist would do with information of different degrees of reliability. So they don't just represent an on or an off. They represent a degree of belief in a proposition. And for the students, these neurons are computing logarithms of ratios of probability. So when you learn these things in your math classes, your brain is doing it all the time so that you can actually learn. This interesting little circularity there. So the brain is rational. That's pretty important to realize. But you might wonder, why are humans so often irrational in their decision making? Okay, I'm going to try to answer that. So I'm going to give you two answers, okay? One is that through the lens of neuroscience, some seemingly irrational tendencies may in fact be rational. So I'll give you an example. Actually, this is something that Sheena made famous. It's a topic called choice overload that's very much associated with her work. And so economists tell us that it's rational to prefer more choices. You know, you'd like the store to have more brands of a jam. That's a famous example of hers. And then, but the observation that Sheena made, was that there are too many. When there's too many options, humans may forgo making any choice at all. They don't buy anything in the store, for example. And that seems irrational to the economist. Okay. Well, we did an experiment. Actually, Anne, who's moderating, did this experiment with a bunch of other colleagues, and we just asked humans, in this case, to make two decisions, to tell us what's the net direction of these moving dots, but also what's the dominant color. And what we found, and they have to answer both questions. So, you know, right and yellow, right and blue, left and yellow, left and blue. And what we found out, to make a long story short, is that the difficulty of either judgment didn't affect the performance on the other. They looked like they were performing this task in parallel, but they weren't. They were competing for the time. They could not do two decisions at the same time, what this implies, and I'm not going to explain this diagram in the interest of time, but there's a bottleneck in the brain that means that you can't really make two decisions at the same time. So it could be that for choice overload, decisions take time. The more decisions you're trying to make take more time in an additive way, and time is costly. So deciding not to decide may be the rational choice. In fact, it's a way that animals ultimately trade off their speed accuracy, and how we do too, when we are actually performing optimally. The second answer I would put this way. It's a little bit different. So it's that the rational brain, very rational under the hood, under the skull, slips on its tail. And by tail I mean its storytelling abilities, its narrative. Okay? And that is a consequence of consciousness. Now, in the remaining minute, I'll have to tell you how consciousness works, and I'm going to do it. Okay, but first, let me give you an example of what this problem is. So, this is a famous problem put forth by Kahneman and Tversky, that Linda is a 31-year-old, single, outspoken, and very bright. She majored in philosophy, and as a student, she was deeply concerned with issues of discrimination and social justice, and also participated in anti-nuclear demonstrations. And then you're asked a series of questions, and I'll give you the two on the list. One, Linda's a bank teller, and the other one, Linda's a bank teller and active in the feminist movement. Which of these two do you think is most likely? Okay, answer it yourself, for just in your head, and now I'll tell you the answer. It's got to be that Linda's a bank teller, because the probability of two things, bank teller and feminist, has to be less than the probability of one, because probabilities multiply when there are two things happening, and if they multiply, and probabilities are always somewhere between 0 and 1, they can only get to be a smaller number. Now, a lot of people make mistakes. I bet you none of you made this mistake. And if you want to read more about the whole variety of ways that we're irrational in decision making, including doctors on medical problems, you can read the papers by Amos Tversky and Danny Kahneman, or Danny has this beautiful book, Thinking Fast and Slow, and I also recommend this an easy read by the guy that wrote Moneyball. Okay, so I'm going to claim that this comes from storytelling, as I mentioned, but storytelling is a property of our consciousness. And I can tell it to you in about 30 seconds. So, you know, we said before that this knowledge, gnosis, has the structure of an interrogation in the form of might I? Might I reach for this? Might I hold my hand a certain way if I'm going to grab something? Might I mate with this? Might I eat this? Might I avoid this toxin? And so forth. We don't have to do these things, but we're organizing the information from memory and from the senses so that they bear on those kinds of decisions. Now, consider the following. This guy is about to grab this drill. And this drill affords a lot of possible things to him, like how he would grab it, how he would which hand he should move, how he would maybe move it along the table. Maybe he's going to put a hole in the wall with it. All the kinds of things that he would do with this drill is his knowledge of the drill. Okay? He has a knowledge of the back of the drill that's precluded by the front of the drill from his point of view. But now, let's imagine there's another person in the room. This woman, she also has knowledge of this drill, and she also has all those kind of affordance knowledge. She could grab it, she could drill a hole in it, maybe she could use it as a weapon even. You know, who knows? Lots of things you could do with a drill, not that you should. Now, both of these people have one special kind of an affordance, or one special kind of thing they could do, one special might I, the thing we could fill in the blank, and that's to report to another agent. Everything in the world, every event in the world is potentially reportable to another agent. And when we consider the report, now we're not thinking about aspects of the drill like where it is in the visual field or how heavy it might be or how you'd hold your hand to grab it. You're actually considering that it exists in the mind of another, sort of independent of yourself. So the drill has a presence in the world independent of me. I like to call that deriving Plato's essences, okay? So suddenly, that's how we know the world consciously. It's just because our brain engaged the world, just as it might engage the world with a potential eye movement, it engages it with a potential report. Now, potential reports have the content of narrative, of storytelling. The drill had an origin. It was purchased at some point, maybe, whatever. You know, the world has an origin, like we make up stories, like God or something made it. You know, so that's what's so important to us about consciousness. We can teach things to our children, and by having that ability, we can solve problems that would be very hard to solve using probability theory, like medical diagnosis or even navigation across seas and so forth. So this is very important to our culture. It probably means we're going to blow up the world and make it melt or burn. But for the time being, we view consciousness as a good thing. And that's what leads to our irrationality, and it's actually the irrationality of the slow brain that is the one that lets us tell stories. So I'll stop and just give you some closing points, just really for the teachers and students in the group, which is that knowledge is. I want to just press on you that knowledge is attained through a process of interrogation. So in a sense, we must learn how to interrogate, not just the facts. So we, as teachers, and that's what that we do too, is we are teaching really the tools to acquire. And for the students, you want to hone and acquire new skills because you see the world differently, because you ask different questions of the world with the new tools that you possess. And with that, I'll thank you and mention that many people do the work in my lab, and in fact, much more work than I do, and thank my funders.